right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, super excited to be back in conversation with Abdaljawad Omar. I think this is 8. I'm not sure. Obviously, the title, I had to try to do the math. I think we're on day 199 today, officially. And tomorrow would be the 200th day since October 7th. But, definitely wanted to catch up with the boot again and talk about a lot of things that have happened since our last conversation. There's been a lot going on um, in Gaza, in the West Bank, um, in 48 as well, and in around the world, internationally, in the United States, in the last week, but certainly in the last, 2 or 3 weeks. I think it's probably been about a month since our last conversation. So there's a lot to get to. Um, and I'm just going to bring Abud. You all know who this person is at this time. So I'm going to bring him to the stage and we'll just get into it. So, Abud, good to be in conversation with you again.
I'm happy to be with you, Jared. Like always, of course.
Yeah, same.
Except for not being allowed to smoke part during the.
You can, yeah, I don't care actually. We had Ziad El Nabolsi on recently, and he was vaping throughout the interview. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Vaping.
Anyway, so before we get to, there's a number of things that we've kind of laid out that we do want to discuss today, but I think before we get into some of the specifics, I wanted to kind of just give you a more open-ended place to start, to just kind of zoom out a bit and offer some analysis of some of the most significant developments that we've seen over the last 199 days, soon to be 200. And what are some of the key things that you're monitoring currently?
Thanks, Jared. I mean, it's a tough question to actually try and disentangle, because your question kind of harkens back to an issue we face when we're daily on the news, which is that we're like looking at any progress or difference in the small events or small issues that might be happening on the ground here and there, or the bigger issues that could be unfolding. Not by small, I'm not trying to belittle anything that is happening on a daily level, but small in the sense of being removed from like the more historical process that is unfolding since 6 months or so, or 7 months now. And I think it's important that we go back to October 7th and try to contextualize it as a breakthrough in a historical process that started 3 decades ago, in my opinion. And that went from, different phases of guerrilla warfare, one where people fight to just have the capacity to resist itself, towards a strategic equilibrium for a long time. And now what I would describe October 7th as the opening salvo in a more offensive maneuver or offensive form of attack, where the guerrilla does not only retreat and attempt to create some form of equilibrium, but the guerrilla forces attempt to actually force the enemy to start a process of disintegration, deformation, and all the things that we have spoken about in the past couple of episodes together. And I think in that sense, October 7th was a culmination of that process. And it succeeded in doing 2 things. First of all, it succeeded in surprising Israel, in catching it unprepared, and at the same time in successfully executing the operation itself, but also in opening the floodgates of a regional constellation of forces um, under the umbrella of resistance axis that is now operating on different fronts, including in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and recently Iran. And I think this is one of the most strategically significant successes for the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, that this battle is not being fought only within Palestine itself, but on different fronts simultaneously. Of course, there are some people who would claim that there should have been more participation by resistance forces rather than the level of participation that they have committed to thus far. And there's a big discussion and heated debate, but I think it takes away from the fact that this is for the first time, perhaps in 40 years, you have a simultaneous fronts being opened that operate also within a form of guerrilla warfare thinking, where you want to draw out the power of the more superior state, in this case Israel, but at the same time you want to frustrate it, accumulate that frustration over time, and lead it to its own abyss by placing it in front of difficult dilemmas and choices, whether strategically, politically, socially, or even on a psychological level. And I think since October 7th until today, we've had that development become the daily modus, the daily mode of engagement with Israel. A war of attrition that is offensive. Of course, in that war, Palestinians are paying a big price in the Gaza Strip specifically. And at the same time, it's frustrating Israel because it's incapable of building not only an image of victory, but what it claims that it wants, which is a total form of victory. A total form of victory means that you completely paralyze your enemy's ability to resist, which is something that is more of an impossibility, in the sense that also these resistance forces were built, they're designed to withstand the assault of a superior force. They were built to sustain themselves through their time, despite the superiority of the firepower that Israel has. They were designed as such, whether it's through, materially, architecturally, in terms of tunnels, for instance, in Gaza, or in the context of also Lebanon and Yemen, in terms of being able to, withstand strikes by a superior air force without completely breaking down, without that air power being able to completely disrupt the network that the resistance forms. And in this sense, despite the fact that for a long time the Palestinians, for a lot of different reasons, were attempting to compress the time of this war because of its human cost, because of the intentions that Israel declared from the outset, which is to genocide and ethnically cleanse and destroy Gaza. That in the current juncture that we find ourselves in, Israel is growingly frustrated, and we talked about that. Remember, in January, I was already pointing out that as more time unfolds, these frustrations will only increase and accumulate, and it will lead Israel to lash out in some instances. It will lead to an attempt to, for instance, to expand the war and its horizon with other forces in the region. But at the same time that it does so, it will also risk exposing itself as more weaker on a political level, diplomatic level, but also military level than it actually is, or that it actually was capable of convincing people in the region and beyond that it is. And in this sense, I think we're at this point where Israel is, sinking in its own lack of strategy, refusal, and political disavowal. Does not want to talk politics and thinks that there's a military solution to every problem that it has. And in this sense, the choice for October 7th was, in retrospect, perhaps, as many would say, the beginning of the end of at least the form of colonialism and control that we've had for a long time, but also has deeper and wider implications on the region itself. At least that's one part of the equation. So in my reading, I think this is an opening salvo in a more offensive, direct confrontation, forcing the enemy towards, a political language that it refused to speak to for at least 2 decades, thinking itself more superior, etc. But I think that it also comes at a time, and I think this is, perhaps, although I'm risking here a lot of things because, as the war unfolds, there's still a struggle of wills, desires, and of course force that goes on with war. So this might be too hasty in terms of our assessment, because I do think that we should, at least when we read history, we should maintain this kind of longue durée type of thinking, going all the way into the past and trying to also construct what future or what possible futures exist at the same moment. That the choice for October 7th that comes after, the heydays of the eruption of Arab demonstrations in 2011 and the, fast and rapid internal conflicts that arose between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces in different Arab countries. It comes in a moment where US power itself is reformulating itself around the construction and solidification of alliance system, whether it's in Europe through NATO or whether it's in the Arab world through its relationship to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Emirates, Bahrain, and other partners that it finds in the region. Its need for these alliances to be more tight and solid, to confront the challenge of a rising China, to confront the challenge of, a more assertive Iranian power, but at the same time, Russia and Ukraine and what it led to also in terms of, basically giving Europe to American power once again and reaffirming this NATO alliance through time and expanding it. So the Americans have been in the past couple of years really trying and attempting to solidify their alliance system because they need these alliances, whether it's in Southeast Asia or it's in the Middle East or in Europe, to sustain their hegemony throughout the 21st century and to construct political, military, and diplomatic tools that enable them to contain the rising power of competitors or peer competitors like China and Russia, and also in the region, at least Iran and its allies. And it came in a moment where the Americans were trying to get also the Arab-Israeli dimension of the conflict done with, at least on the level of state systems. And here it's, of course, always important to differentiate between, a bunch of Arab governments led by specific families that have a long history of collaborating with imperial powers and centers, and between the people living within these different entities that might have different feelings. And that's part of the tension also currently in the alliance system, at least in the sense of trying, or these countries trying to balance between, their complete devotion to the American arrangement of power in the Middle East, but at the same time, fearing the implications of either a regional war and what it means to their power or their ability to sustain themselves in positions of power in their own countries, or also the wrath and anger of their own populations, that when they look at TV and see Palestinians being killed in mass, of course, are accumulating a lot of anger. So there's a delicate balance here. So October 7th came and disrupted this, let's say, entrenchment and solidification. It doesn't mean that it will end it, but it did indeed disrupt it. And it created, let's say, new possibilities around what could really be constructed around America trying to get Israel to become a regional hegemon alongside several of the Arab countries that play an important role in regional politics. And at the same time, it was a choice of a moment where the axis of resistance itself was already constructing this term, which is called the unity of fields, no? And this unity of fields was meant to signal that from now on, the attention of this axis will not be concentrated on necessarily Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Yemen. All are important, areas, but will now also be united on the level of participation and actual engagement with any attempt to liberate Palestine from its colonial condition. And a lot of people have criticized this concept that was, for the past couple of years have been, an important introduction, or has been introduced to the dictionary of political speak in the region. And many people in the region ridiculed it because they saw it as, an exaggeration or just a propaganda ploy, or they viewed it in very cynical terms. However, from its outset, it was constructed so that each area, or each resistance group, let's put it in that way, would choose the level of its engagement depending on also its own internal contradictions, the society that it exists among, the possibilities, the accumulation of power that it has. So it's not, it's not an alliance system like NATO, where any attack is considered an attack against everybody, but it's a unifying concept where people can, or these resistant groups can all place themselves under its service, depending on what is possible within each geography or each area. And I think that kind of approach and the choice of October 7th in this sense go hand in hand, because I don't think the Palestinian resistance would have done or committed October 7th without at least a minimal understanding that others in the region will also be interfering on its behalf. Maybe, I don't know what planning went into this. Maybe they thought it will be a larger level of participation, maybe a lesser level of participation, but at least there was that understanding that there will be multiple fronts facing the Israeli regime, and that the war will not be confined to the Gaza Strip or to a specific area whatsoever. And I think this kind of multi-pronged strategy, with Palestine being the opening salvo, and the opening salvo coming also from within Palestine in a surprise attack that was successful, perhaps even more successful than was anticipated, created this moment where the floodgates on Israel's legitimacy, moral standing, diplomatic standing, legal standing, and also its military standing and ability to deter its enemies is all in question. Its credibility as a power, the credibility of even speaking, any form of truth is being questioned. So it is a very intricate moment for the choice of time. It caught everybody by surprise, but at least it's been brewing for a long time. And to me, and maybe I said this before in our podcast, it was always surprising to me that despite the fact that many of the forces of resistance were engaged in the war in Syria or in other confrontations here and there, that Israel never pounced, never took the opportunity of these forces being stretched out to redefine its deterrence strategy vis-a-vis its adversaries in the region. That it waited, and in this waiting, those adversaries are the ones who actually initiated a creative form of operation that we saw in at least the offensive maneuver that took place on October 7th. So it's a culmination of a historical process. It's now entrenching, at least until this moment, this alliance system between resistance groups around Palestine, and centered around the ability to liberate Palestine from its colonial condition. And it's also, in many ways, creating a lot of difficult problems for American power in the region and for Israel's power of deterrence. And in this sense, it is an opening salvo that thus far has been on a level of at least its strategic implications successful when viewed from Palestinian resistance point of view. things could change later on. It could, things could balance in a different way. But this is at least my take, at least with when it comes to the big picture of what has been unfolding thus far.
Thank you for that overview and that breakdown. I think along, continuing kind of in a related sense, because Iran obviously is, one, you mentioned them in terms of their regional significance, which we see on full display within U.S. media, and within among U.S. Politicians, the view of Iran as an adversary of the United States. Um, and and obviously Iran has had a important role. I mean, I think folks should read the work of Amal Saad to kind of, because she does a good job of not following into this kind of description of all the access actors as proxies for Iran and things like that, right? But looking at them, as you kind of said, with that unity of fields discussion of kind of acting in a kind of shared interests across different regions, and taking actions of their own dependent upon you know what they think they can achieve and what makes sense within their own contexts. um but the obviously there was, for folks, I will go ahead and say this because some folks may have heard about this through mainstream news rather than people who don't lie to them for a living. So, obviously, Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Syria, killing a number of, um, you know, military officials, I think also diplomats. Um, and, you know, I don't think that we have to say that if this happened to any country around the world, certainly any European or Western country, that there would be a significant retaliation significant military retaliation, and probably sanctioning as well for such an operation, right? So, um, but nonetheless, there was, I think, understandably, given Israel's military strength and whatnot historically, some people didn't think that Iran would respond very forcefully to this attack. And of course, I think they launched 500 missiles and drones. I don't know, that I haven't s- delved deeply into the operation, but obviously launched a lot. Were able to strike airports from which operations had been flown and such. Um, and I know that there's obviously going to be a variety of opinions on this from a Palestinian perspective. Um, but I'm interested in what you made of kind of the significance of this development to kind of where we are, and maybe also the significance from a Palestinian point of view in terms of, because some people said, "Oh, this doesn't mean that much, or it's not that significant what they did, etc." So, yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, look, first of all, I mean, the idea that Israel struck an embassy with impunity is, highly important, at least in this discussion, because at least on a one of the things that we've been seeing from Israel in the past couple of months is that wherever there's a line that shouldn't be crossed, they're willing to cross it, and they hope that through this crossing of each line, that they're shocking not only the Palestinians, not only the Arabs, not only adversaries of perhaps the state of Israel, but also the world, in attempting to tell the world this is what modern Western technology could do to you. And I think this is why there's a universal aspect to what's happening in Palestine. Universal aspect, not in the sense of only transgression of laws and war crimes, but also that it's a message to all, perhaps the wretched of the earth, of what the what abilities and capacities for death and destruction and horror can modern Western technology inflict. And of course, in the sense of the embassy, it's not too much about what technology can do, but it's also about attempting to transgress one of the oldest rules in diplomacy that people have tried to safeguard as much as possible, which is to maintain that embassy should not be attacked, and a messenger should not be killed. At least that was in many ways highly problematic for the Israeli side and also the American side in trying to justify the operation. I think they failed to convince their own populations largely of the illegitimacy of the Iranian counterattack because of the initial transgression that Israel committed. And we all saw many of these politicians try to defend Israel and say this is a massive attack by Iranians, but it didn't really have much credibility to it, at least when it's for people who are observing this from far away, even those who are not necessarily vested in this whole war. I mean, it just spewed with a lot of hypocrisy. But beyond these media points, if you want, I do think that the Iranian counterattack is significant. It's significant for the first reason, which is that Iran said, we've placed us in the beginning of this war, that there's always a potential for things to become regional, for the war to develop and escalate into a regional war. Now it's not theoretical. Now we saw that the Iranians themselves are willing, of course, under an attempt to also not go to a scenario where regional war would happen, by telegraphing the attack, by making sure nobody gets hurt in the attack, by targeting only military bases, by all the things that it did before the attack to ensure that it also has legitimacy, going to the Security Council, trying to get condemnation, etc. So the Iranians move on different fronts to ensure that on the one hand it will attack, but on the other hand that it will not provide the Israelis the opportunity to drag the US and the rest of the West into a showdown with Iran that could turn regional. However, despite that, what we've gotten through this counterattack by Iran is a validity to the theory, to the axiom that we were holding, that Iran might at some point interfere in this conflict and might at some point place also its own power, its abilities, its military capacities directly in the confrontation, not only in the backdrop. And this really scares a lot of people, not only in the region but also beyond, because a regional war is an end to any form of economic recovery, between quotes. It's it's an Armageddon situation for the global international economy, and one of the fundamental products that it relies on, which is oil and gas, natural gas, that the region has large quantities of, and sets the price for, or is influential in setting the price for. And any regional war, whether it's devastating for Iran, it's also going to be devastating for the global economy at large. It will destroy any chances, for instance, that Biden will have a re-election campaign that is successful. It will completely increase inflationary pressures on the global economy. So there's this large threat that now is materialized on some level, and has become more professed by this exchange that happened between Israel and Iran directly. And I think this made a lot of people beyond the region more anxious and more willing to contemplate the need to pressure or place more pressure on Israel to finish its war in the Gaza Strip as well. So it has some form of direct consequences on also the temporality of war in the Gaza Strip. In the sense that the more this wide confrontation lasts, the more the risk for an escalation in the conflict could happen. Now, I do think that Israel did benefit somewhat from this exchange, It's a very small benefit beyond the tactical, assassination of two important Iranian generals. It did or is able to understand that it could construct some form of leverage vis-a-vis its own allies by risking also regional conflict. So it can use the leverage it has of taking the whole world into this abyss to then compromise with its allies on what is possible beneath going all in into a regional configuration. However, despite that, doing that also in the long term erodes its importance strategically, diplomatically, and otherwise. It changes people's opinion, not my opinion or people on the street and people committed to the Palestinian struggle, but people who are in power in different countries in the region. Its view of Israel as a reliable ally, responsible, that acts in ways that could actually benefit not only itself, but also a wide or larger form of alliance that America was hoping to forge in the region, as we spoke earlier. So in many ways, Israel looks kind of like mad to a lot of, but also mad and incapable of going through with its madness when it comes to Iran. And that's what happened through the exchange, because it assassinated, it risked regional confrontation with Iran. Iran responded. And beyond now the discussion about whether it's was it a significant response or not a significant response, and I'm sure that a lot of people heard the economic arguments. Israel, Iran used cheap weapons. Israel used highly sophisticated and expensive weapons that they cannot use for a long term because it will erode their economic base, and also the ammunitions are, and whether there's intelligence being, whether Iran succeeded in garnering a lot of intelligence about how the air defense systems works, and all these tactical and operational issues that people were like exchanging between many of the Western leaders saying that and also Israel itself saying how successful its defense was, and between those who are also saying that the Iranian attack was significant because at the end it actually hit some of the bases that it targeted. Beyond that, I mean, this is an important discussion, but I don't want to go to it. I think that also it deterred or eroded Israel deterrence in the region, because Iran reformulated its deterrence equation with Israel. It said that any attack on Iranian assets or Iranian personnel or Iranian interests will deem to be an attack against Iran itself. It placed Israel in a corner. Israeli response, at least the way it looks, we don't know much about it, but the way it looks seems weak and fragile and did not really take things up a notch. So it did not escalate, it de-escalated. Its importance was that we're just, we're returning the favor on some level. And it showed that, when it comes to the Iranians calling the Israeli bluff, that Israel winked. I mean, that is the level that of the engagement and the exchange that happened. And I think this, of course, has implications on larger publics and how they view it, despite all the media propaganda on what happened and unfolded during the attacks, and the exchange of rockets and firepower between Israel and Iran. And at the same time has implications for the nature of the engagement in the coming weeks between Iran and Israel, but also between the Axis of Resistance and Israel itself. So in this way, Israel perhaps attempted to widen and escalate the conflict vertically and horizontally, meaning drawing in more powers into it. Maybe that was its intention, or it did not assess that Iran would respond. Maybe that's the truth. We don't know necessarily what exactly Israel was thinking by targeting the Damascus embassy of the Iranian state. But in many ways, Israel, through this exchange, has lost some of its power. And also it's leading, I think, some of its own direct or indirect allies in the region to reassess their view of their relationship with Israel, whether it's actually beneficial, whether they would get the same form of air defense systems to protect them from an Iranian attack in any future confrontation or conflict or war that erupts, in the Gulf region. or and on another level, on whether they can rely on Israel to actually be a force in containing Iranian power in the region or not. One of the driving forces for actually this kind of more public alliance that has been rising in the past couple of years between some of the Arab states like Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel itself. Generally speaking, that was just more of a secret alliance that nobody's spoken about before, but now they felt more comfortable in placing it front and center in terms of their own policy and more publicly. So for me, at least, I think this is a significant historic event. It's the first time since 1991 that any state in the region directly attacks Israel, and Israel came out looking weaker, despite any operational successes that it had in terms of air defenses. And at the same time, I think it reformulated the deterrence between the Iranians and the Israelis. The only benefit, again, is that Israel leveraged not going through a bigger attack, perhaps with its American allies and Europeans, to get some compromises here and there that it wanted from its own allies. But again, when you do that once or you do it twice, it erodes your credibility with your own partners, because you can take them hostage and take their interest hostage. And the UK, France, and Britain, and the US, they don't want and they don't seek a regional confrontation due to the damage, again, to the global economy. And if you're taking their interests hostage, you're looking more and more as a sick and ailing ally, undependable, and that one that does not take your own allies' interests into consideration when you're planning and executing attacks or conducting operations. So, I mean, it comes with a price, at least in the medium run and long run, for Israel. That's my take on the exchange between Iran and Israel.
Appreciate that. And you said something, in terms of, Biden and the election. And look, folks, like, I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. I've said this before here, but I didn't think Biden would beat Trump in 2020. And I was clearly wrong about that. But I also thought that before, the George Floyd uprisings, as COVID-19 mishandling, all of these things that really turned a lot of, I hate using the term like moderate or centrist, but just the weird people in the middle of the United States that vacillate between the ruling class parties. But uh, this week, when, you know, between sending 26 billion more in aid to Israel right now, um, and sending out a statement condemning the protesters at Columbia, and other universities around the United States as anti-Semitic and, supporting terrorism or whatever else they want to, whatever other, slurs and invectives they want to throw at young people who are, and I want to be clear, they are both protesting genocide, and many of them are expressing clear solidarity with Palestinian resistance too. And I think both of those things are important. Um, and So, I say that because there's one narrative that we're hearing around this stuff that is saying, oh, well, they're peaceful protesters and they're, just, and yeah, I mean, most of everything that I've seen has been, nonviolent or whatever. Um, but then the right wing's response is saying, oh, no, like, look at all these videos, you know, expressing solidarity with Hamas or Qassam or, et cetera, right? And saying that they're supporting terrorism, right? So that's part of the narrative we have in the United States in terms of a counterinsurgency narrative within the media. And I think it's very important that students, the young people, are rejecting both of those attempts to demonize um, their encampments, their solidarity actions, which have picked up steam. I think, you know, I mean, it was a week ago was April 15th, and we saw a lot of actions going around the country. There's also the Freedom Flotilla that's coming up in terms of people that are going to try to break the siege on Gaza, bringing aid in as a kind of direct action maneuver from around the world. But the college campus thing in the United States is very interesting, in part because it you know there's been a lot of student organizing, but Columbia does have this kind of symbolic importance and real importance in terms of the fact that a lot of these are children of ruling class folks. I mean, we talked about this a little bit with Lara and Stephen Chihai yesterday, and there are, of course, always some people who are first gen immigrants or students on visas and things like that that are at these schools, and so it's not all one thing. But the goal of institutions like Columbia, like Harvard, like Yale, is to produce the people who will be in the consulting firms and the think tanks and the politicians and the leaders, quote unquote, in the upper managerial class of US institutions. And so for it's I mean, on one level, it's a dramatic failure of these institutions to produce what it is supposed to produce. And I think in many ways this is what has Congress so upset. So why they're calling all these presidents of these institutions before the carpet, because they're saying these are I mean, in some respects, I mean, literally in certain respects, they are their children. But in many ways, on a broader level, in terms of the management of the country and its foreign policy and its politics, these are the children who are supposed to carry on the legacy, and they're supposed to be Zionists. They're supposed to be imperialists. And so all of that is significant. And I think that you had said a few things in a thread that, you can expand on it here. You can respond to what I'm saying too. Um, about the difference, which I think would be interesting to kind of talk about a little bit, between like a Palestinian university and, the idea that I think stood out to you was that the students were arrested and that the president sort of asked them to be arrested. Um, and I don't know. I mean, for me, I mean, the US has a very long history of actually pretty violent responses to student protest and dissent. Obviously things like Kent State and I think Jackson State and um, others if we go far enough back. But even, I mean, not that long ago, students being tear gassed in the face at Berkeley and all kinds of stuff. And so there's a lot of there's an interesting climate in the United States, a lot of hatred, especially at upper institutions against colleges in general in the United States are very anti free speech and anti protest, actually. Um, but anyway, I just wanted to give you space to talk about some of the significance of these events from your perspective and kind of what you're thinking about them. And we can dialogue in it to some degree if you want to too, because I obviously have my opinions too.
I mean, one of the significant, again, issues that rose or came through after October 7th, and I remember talking perhaps to you about it, is that, and from the beginning, I told all my friends that for the past also 20, 30 years, Palestinians and their friends across the world have created enough institutional infrastructure, media infrastructure, relations, to be able to create a moment where there at least will not be consensus around what's happening and unfolding in Palestine. And I think that from the beginning, that was a moment that, because a lot of times, I mean, for a lot of Palestinians, it's always the case, is that because we want our salvation now, we don't see anything as good enough. Like we tend to um, underestimate our own power in many ways. And the discourse sometimes could be nihilistic, and sometimes could be very, it will look at any act as being completely devoid of any impact. And it's always dangerous to go towards those zones, specifically when you still have ongoing catastrophe and war and genocide unfolding, that you start thinking that, whether I'm writing or not, whether I'm protesting or not, nothing really changes, or nothing really stops at the moment we want it to stop. And, that's a dangerous game to play. And I was sure that this moment will be a moment where people will have a new understanding and appreciation for the Palestinian experience more broadly. And they'll find connections with it that they didn't think they can establish. One of the issues that I personally attempted to work on was that this is also a moment to explain why it's one of the most natural things for any people under occupation to simply resist and find creative ways to resist. And that, resistance, whether it's by groups or non-groups, does not mean necessarily that you have to condone every action that a resistance fighter does or doesn't do. It doesn't mean blind loyalty. It means just that you would place yourself as belonging to this moment, this attempt to change the world that the Palestinian resistance launched. You might have problems with tactics, you might have problems with ethical questions, and you have moral reckoning that you want to engage with, and you need to understand the history behind this and why it manifested and why it unfolded the way it unfolded. But that this is a moment where you can tell a different story than just Palestinians are victims. Palestinians are, people devoid of agency, just always dissected, created, constituted, reconstituted by power, which is not necessarily the full picture of what unfolds really in Palestine. And I think, look, personally, I think people do want to hear an energetic story. It's not only they want to hear a story about Palestinians being, docile victims, when in fact, we've invented various radical traditions. We've, been confronting this condition of ours for more than a century. You can date it back to the late 19th century if you want. Continued struggle. We have a whole dictionary of words around resistance and, its experience in the Palestinian tradition. There's a very rich, literary and intellectual and philosophical and historical, if you want, tradition that, went along with the Palestinian story. And this is a time for the people who are willing to listen to also listen to this story. I mean, that is one of the things. And I think it's always the case that young people who are, perhaps less calculated when it comes to their own, positions in life. They still don't have a vested interest in a job and material well-being, that these young people would be one of the people that are willing to listen. It's always the case that young people are, more open to the world, less formed in terms of their opinion, and less rigid. And therefore, I don't find it anything, surprising to see one of the manifestations and one of the areas where the struggle is unfolding is the university. First of all, because the young are willing to listen. Second of all, because the universities have also seen, at least from a point of view that is from different point of view, a large presence of critical leftist and other voices within it. And some would say this is a way where the system tries to co-opt revolutionaries to becoming docile academics. And that might be the true, but it's still a place, in the Gramscian tradition that where counter-hegemonic discourses exist. And that's part of the reason why, you see a lot of right-wing spokespersons, for example, launching an attack against universities and some of, the humanities and social sciences, because they do understand that that's a place where they have very little influence in terms of, their own presence within these disciplines and who's present within these disciplines, and the nature of and the pedagogy of teaching, beyond any now discussion of what better pedagogy or otherwise. So I don't find it surprising that universities are becoming a hotbed for, voices that are standing against genocide and against the war, and also that perhaps in some of these students they find a receptive voice to hear the story of Palestinian resistance throughout a century or so. I think the other thing is that there's a dissonance, no, because what we've been seeing is also in the wider public in many of the countries we're talking about, like the US. I mean, most people are now, against the war and its continuation, no? But the establishment and its mechanisms of consensus making is not creating enough consensus for the policies that the establishment is pursuing, which is to give Israel weapons, increase its financing, ensuring that Israel is well defended, between quotes, or has the capacity to inflict massacres and continue with its massacres. At least this is my own view of it. And I think that in many ways that dissonance is expanding. You just don't find within the system avenues for you to change or redirect policy. And as the war continues, I think people will try to find other avenues: direct action, protest, increasing in numbers, student activism, whatever this moment will necessitate in terms of raising awareness, creating disruptions within various collectives and coalitions, institutions. And that's what has been boiling down in many of these institutions. I mean, small little things like editorial collectives disagreeing about to publish an article or not, to like larger things around Columbia University and its policy between selling its own students and allowing the police to come and arrest its own students or not. The ideological fight happening among professors and the ideological fight happening among activists and those who voice support for Israel and those who voice support for the Palestinian issue and what it means on a more universal level, because that's what also matters to me. I don't think this is only about us as Palestinians. Again, I there's a lot of things that we have to remember when it comes to the Palestinian issue, that there's a lot of universal aspects to it. Whether it's the form of technology used to control and kill us, whether it's the nature of the transgressions that Israel is committing that could easily boomerang into the imperial metropole, in the case of the US, for instance, whether it's ideologies of fascism that are being experimented on here that could also, find deep connections with many in the right wing in the US and Europe and other places across the globe. There's a lot of different areas where, that kind of universality of Palestine as also a place that can reveal truths about the nature of the society, the class divisions, the establishment and its character, its hypocrisy, and its willingness to support this ongoing genocide without, any form of remorse or any form of even hesitation. And, the past 6 months has revealed that for a lot of people. And I think they're outraged at their own system. And I think that will continue as the war continues. So I don't find it surprising. What I found surprising to me, I mean, coming from Birzeit University, which has a lot of problems. Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to romanticize Birzeit or anything like that. And I could speak for hours on the problems of Birzeit, But, the thing that I was trying to point out, at least in that tweet, was just a simple fact that, despite the fact that students in the university could be accused, I'm not saying I agree with that, but a lot of people accuse them, the student activists and their representative, of having an overblown power to close the university, of doing strikes sometimes for months, 40 days, 50 days, disrupting the whole economic system and educational system, around sometimes what could be also considered not necessarily essential issues that could be worked out in a different way. Again, not necessarily I'm agreeing with that, but I'm just saying that it's a legitimate argument that people made against many of the student activities in Birzeit University in the past couple of years or historically. The university has been very sensitive about allowing any elements from outside the university to come in and arrest students or disrupt student activities. Doesn't mean that these outside elements sometimes against the wishes of the university, like Israeli, army, or special, units like the Mistarivim, or the, Arabized units, that come in and sometimes have arrested, some of the student activists uh, within the campus or outside of the campus, and sometimes shot at our students, or sometimes with the PA and its police that arrest a lot of the young students outside of the university campus. The university itself never really invited police to come and take out, the students or arrest them. In fact, when a lot of people, for instance, from the Islamic Coalition, which is part of the student body, were being persecuted by the PA, they would find safety in the campus because the university would say to the police, you cannot enter, and they would sleep and continue to live on campus instead of leaving the campus. And, the university was a place where you can be prevented from being arrested, not a place where you would be, where your own administration invites the police to arrest you. And I think this is that for me was, slightly, I wouldn't say shocking, but slightly, surprising that, the university president decides to arrest her own students without any, consideration. On a more political level, it actually, backfires. A lot of times these forms of policies are stupid, and they tend to ensure that, what was perhaps a small encampment becomes a bigger encampment, that more students feel threatened by such actions by the university president, that more people from the community come and engage, and that these forms of engagement become wider, more widespread, more controversy around them, and that using force only, specifically against a university that is supposed to nurture, develop students, teach them to think critically, and at the end they find their own university, it's using force against them, against a form of nonviolent protest. It becomes highly a moment for galvanization of, let's say, more troops in the struggle rather than the other way around. And it shows because what you mentioned, the ideological side of this fight, this attempt to link the students to anti-Semitism, to violence, to this perpetual victim status that some, Zionists want to abuse and use in ways that, I think is problematic even to the Jewish world more broadly. It's not working. I mean, it's working perhaps in convincing MSNBC or I don't know, CNN to launch this kind of ideological attack. And perhaps it touches, and a lot of people listen to this, and maybe it in their eyes, legitimates violence against the students and arrest of students. Maybe perhaps on some level, it has some success on this level. But in fact, again, if everything is anti-Semitic, then nothing is. And in many ways, that's what's been happening when it comes to this ideological fight, this attempt to link people to feelings they don't have. This attempt to also link Palestinians to anti-Semitism, which, for any commonsensical person would find, outrageous for just one specific reason. It assumes that if any other people came and conquered our land, that we would not resist that person, because our problem that the person conquering is his identity. I really couldn't give any, damn about who is coming to conquer. What the way in which he identifies him or herself is not really relevant to me, except if I'm curious or because it has some sort of implication on the nature of, the struggle that is unfolding. So again, that form of attack is as ideological, it is as much as the mainstream is trying to use, as much as Congress is trying to place front and center. I think it's meeting a lot of deaf ears at this moment and at this particular historical conjuncture. And I think for that and many other reasons, this will continue to happen, this unfolding, this disruption of institutions and collectives, and the students are one side, of the energies around the Palestinian struggle that is unfolding now, and will have also implications in the future, not only in terms of who will come in the future and become a diplomat. People can change their loyalties, and they can play the game when they become more older, and hide their feelings around certain issues, and people make these pragmatic choices, etc. That's not necessarily my hope. Is that now we have a new imperial class that is more sympathetic to the Palestinians. I think my own issue is that the consensus around Israel in the US has ended, and if it ever exists, of course, that it never really totally existed, but it ended, and people are rightfully questioning the support that the US is giving to Israel, and there will be implications on the level of elections, because as much as this consensus making institutions that exist in the US, the lobby is one of them. Like we've talked about this whole discussion between the material underpinning of support for Israel that many of our friends, for instance, talk to and speak about, that come from like the Samir Amin tradition of viewing Israel as a strategic asset for what it permits in terms of the accumulation of capital and its role in this intricate system. And and we need to think about the economic base of this support and why Israel is necessary on some level. And with people talking about cultural or religious or settler affinities, or they talk about the influence of the Israel lobby in DC, but what we can at least agree on is that the lobby or the media have been an important parts of creating consensus, whether among the political establishment or within the wider society, around the issue of supporting Israel. Because at the end there will be a problem, a tension between what the establishment will see as what serve its economic interests, its political interest, it's whatever religious fantasy they believe in this establishment, and the wider dissonance within American society around the issue of Israel and its support. And that will also create problems where people will start to shrink the democratic space. Whatever we think about that, what it means to be a civic person that engages and raises his voice, what form of speech is allowed and what form of speech is not allowed, how do you control language. I mean, there's an attempt, and it's been going on for a couple of years now, because the Palestinian struggle have made headways in terms of convincing more and more people to listen to our own story and narrative. One of the responses is like setting up laws against speech, setting up laws against action around Palestine, setting up laws that cast a wide net on what anti-Semitism is, because they know and they understand that now they're losing the argument. And I mean, it was always a lost argument. It's just people were not willing to listen to it. But now people are willing to listen, and they're losing the argument. They're losing the ideological fight, and that the only way to maintain that form of or that level of support is through corrosive mechanisms. So at least in the immediate future, Jared, the bad news is that these corrosive mechanisms will only increase, no? They will become much more professed. But as they increase, they will also create, I think, at least on some level, a much more active and wider, resistance movement to these forms of corrosion. And people will, find ways to escape them, defy them, and attempt to break their hold, whether through legal action, whether through the whatever it is, direct action movements that coalesce around. And this moment in October 7th is playing out differently in different countries, different settings, whether it's in the global south or north or whatever you want to call it. But it has it's creating this reckoning within institutions, within all of these different forms of or different places where ideological and hegemonic counter struggle can take place and unfold.
Much appreciated. I do, just to respond a little bit, I mean, I do totally agree with the point you made about the yeah, I don't know that I've ever seen. I mean, I've seen some really bad letters from university presidents since October 7th. I should say that, because I've seen a lot of letters from university presidents equating their own students with terrorists, especially with regard to SJP's chapters and things like this in the United States, but also like Jewish Voice for Peace and some of these other groups, which is always a fascinating development to me because I think to call a large Jewish group anti-Semitic and terroristic is obviously kind of gives the game away. Um, but I do think there was, I mean, even the fact that the NYPD was willing to go on record as saying that they thought that the arrests were unnecessary. Um, I mean, the NYPD for for decades, I mean, certainly when I lived there, they would arrest people for nothing at all the time. I mean, they would arrest people for standing on the sidewalk and say you were obstructing, the the movement of people. I mean, frivolous arrests were actually their policy. And so for them to issue a statement like that amid the Eric Adams administration, which is, deeply pro police and, would love to see the return of stop and frisk and everything else. And um for them to actually say, there wasn't really any need for this, just also makes her look awful. And I think also, I mean, the point you made too about, yeah, it doesn't work. I mean, yes, Claudia lifted up that there's been encampment since then added in New York at NYU and the new school and soon at the CUNY schools, but also just all over the country. I mean, there's a lot. I'm sure there's too many for me to name and go through, but other Ivies, UNC, I'm hoping that this will become a kind of mass phenomenon over the next, month or so until obviously it'll be interesting to see what happens when the school year ends, which I'm sure is what the administration policy will be at a lot of these places, is to just hope that they can wait it out. Um, but those are they're very significant, developments. And I agree that one, I mean, I think the move to arrest them was totally to appeal to all the people who were interrogating her in front of the Congress and the political people as well as like Zionist donors and things like that. Um, but it won't work because they want to fire her anyway, right? And that's the thing that's so interesting about all of this is watching this has happened now. This will be the third Ivy League president that will end up totally capitulating to these forces and then getting fired anyway, right? Because it will never be enough to kind of appease what these folks want in terms of, they want to, like you said, there has been a break, right, in whatever consensus. There's an end to whatever consensus, the tenuous consensus that existed, and they all want to go back to that place, but they don't have the means to reproduce that consensus. Even with all of, I mean, everything, I think that all the effort that they put into trying to recreate it actually just makes all of their institutions look more illegitimate to people because people are just not that stupid, I mean, that's my take on it. We'll see. Obviously, I think, things change over time. It's one of those things where in moments like this, I think there's always a risk of, as my friend Brooke would say, getting too high on our own supply and feeling like, hey, we're winning. And I think that is the case right now. And then, 6 months, a year from now, maybe we look back on it differently. Um, but I do think the point I wanted to make also, and you talked about this in terms of elections, and you know, one of the things I didn't say, but I wanted to say is that these are the young folks who would be the people that normally get co-opted into the Democratic Party to help it push incremental change come election time. It's these very like this is the history of the Democratic Party is find whatever movement's going on, whether it's, you know, gun violence movements, movements against that in the United States, whether it's the struggles against the elimination of abortion and women's rights, or whether it's Black Lives Matter, right? They find the forces within these movements and they get them to come in and say, hey, vote for us. We'll help you with their issues, which they never do. And now you have just called all of these students anti-Semitic and supporters of terrorism when these students know very well what they are supporting. And they do. They understand. They understand that they're supporting a liberation struggle. And they understand that they're against the atrocities, the genocide that we're seeing, the massacres, right? And our governments and our institutions that are thoroughly embedded and fully are the biggest base of support for these things, right? And so I I just say that that's going to be a really interesting contradiction to watch play out over the next what do we have, 5 months, um, a little less, for election time, because I don't know how they find a base to run Democratic campaigns. Now, maybe they co-opt some folks into some of the progressive quote unquote campaigns that will talk about ceasefire and things like that. And then those campaigns will hopefully be a conveyor belt or a sheepdog into saying, well, you got to vote for Biden too, because we have to be able to get these things through and whatnot. I mean, that probably is the strategy that they will try to employ. But I just think that they have totally just strategically, and maybe there was no response, but I think actually yesterday Lara and Steven said that the response that would have probably been better from these institutions would have been a kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion response of saying, oh, well, we let everybody, we let everybody speak. They're expressing their protests, etc. Right? We meet it with, whatever symbolic things that we can, but they can't. The system won't accommodate that right now because, again, it's not enough for those folks who want to reproduce that consensus and who want, a consensus of the importance of Zionism and the state of Israel. So anyways, I don't know if you have anything to respond to that. I didn't realize I just went on a rant there, but those are some
No,
of
I
my
mean, no, look, I agree with you, but I think that there is an attack on the university that is happening for a long time, like from the right wing. I mean, and I think for a lot in the Republican Party, seeing this unfold, it's an opportunity to indict these universities with these absurd claims, but to continue with this agenda that they've been placing front and center in terms of how universities corrupt the youth and how universities lead people towards ideologies that should not exist in society, whatever these ideologies are. And I think that part of this attack on the university is coming from the establishment, also come from this highly right-wing agenda in the US, and it's coupled with this alliance with Zionism. And I do agree with you when you speak about the Democratic Party and its ability to co-opt movements. But the problem with Palestine, it's not easily co-opted. It becomes the exception, to any form. You cannot co-opt the issue of Palestine. Now, since a month, Biden, what he's been doing, what perhaps if I was his advisor would have told him to do in the beginning, is to create rhetorical distance with Israel, which he failed to do in the beginning. Like, you remember that total identification with Israel was problematic for the Biden administration, because he placed himself in a very naive way politically, without any real reading of the forces that are actually incurring throughout years of Palestinian struggle, without the influence of the left base. I think for many in the Democratic establishment, they said, oh, we'll have a couple of voices, we'll lose some Arab and Islamic votes in America, and that would be the end of it. And we still live in this world where there's very big consensus around support of Israel in the US, the world that we grew up in. And they woke up and they found that that's not true, that you know, the things that have been happening, the forces that have changed demographically, politically, socially, you know, the rise of alternative media, the ability to speak and see for yourself and learn, you know, through various formats, and you know, that also played a role in increasing, alongside Israel's horrific bombing of civilians and civilian infrastructure, its lying and its inability to even, you know, create a propaganda machine that works well. It's complete confusion because they were not ready for all of this, and how it unfolded, that led them to lose large swath of public, and the hypocrisy that, you know, many of the politicians were caught with. So Biden, you know, started this with, you know, complete identification with Israel. Now they're trying to like create some rhetorical distance. You know, we've told Israel not to do this, not to do that, trying to put red lines, trying to like say that we're not on the same page, but we'll continue still to provide Israel with all the means necessary for it to continue its killing. That's also, you know, I think for a lot of people, they can see through this now rhetorical distance that have been created. If that distance was created from the beginning, we wouldn't be here, you know, like in terms of people will view Biden in a different light. You know, like, you know, he's trying to do his best, but he's, you know, in many ways overwhelmed with, you know, the need to support Israel. But you know, that would have been at least a conversation that people would have been able to give Biden. But you know, he fell on his own sword, I think, and for that, you know, the Democratic establishment will have a hard time actually co-opting this movement because it doesn't want to co-opt it first. Second of all, it you know, it runs against its own view of the world, and third and mostly, it's you know, it's an agenda that, you know, disrupts its entire worldview on many levels. So I think, you know, this whole Palestine movement in the U.S. I'm not trying to over exaggerate it. I know that the scene is perhaps much less than we're making it out to be in many ways, you know. And for, you know, the average American, perhaps he still doesn't really care about, you know, what's happening or unfolding on some level. I'm not sure. I'm not in the States. I don't know, and I can't read, you know, what exactly. But I think for people that are part and parcel of the public discourse and conversation and speech and exchange, that Palestine, you know, among those people is now, you know, one of the issues that need to be um, thought about, that Palestinians need to have dignity, and that Israel is more problematic than a lot of those people thought before. And you know, there's a mental shift and activity on the level of many of the people that, you know, work or operate in the public discourse well, and even Jared on the right wing, you know, Tucker Carlson, you know, received and had an interview with Mundir Ishaq, Reverend Mundir Ishaq from Bethlehem. Even in the right, there's breakdown in the relationship between Candace Owen and what's his name, Shapiro, and you know, all that over Palestine. You know, even among conservative and right wing circles, whatever their motivations are, whatever it comes from, there's also this kind of like, you know, moment of reckoning that is happening within their own discourse and view of the world, but it's also happening. So yeah, I mean, you can see it all around. The signs of it is all around, and I think this will continue. And again, you can change a university president. That doesn't change anything about, you know, classroom dynamics or students' opinions or student activism, or you know, you can flux your material hold over universities, but what are you going to do? Destroy the university? I mean, there are there's very little you can do except create also conditions where transgressions of new rules and laws become a sought after affair. You know, like, you know, remember, people also enjoy, especially if you're young, you enjoy transgressions. No, we enjoy, you know, being told something and doing exactly the opposite of what we were being told. We enjoy not listening to our teachers, and we enjoy, if there's a rule we have to break, then maybe we should break, you know, like. And I think if you're going to create around Palestine this kind of taboo topic, that you cannot talk about, and that there's legal consequences and people will be arrested. I mean, I think that will defy even the very, very liberal position of what free speech is, first of all. And in a highly liberal society, that will have certain specific limitations around, to the extent that you can control speech and you can't control speech. But the third thing is that it will galvanize, I think, young people specifically. It will provide them with an avenue where they can assert their identity, authenticity, affirm themselves, and at the same time feel that they belong to the oppressed of the world, and they're fighting a good fight along those oppressed people in the world. So I mean, to me, politically, it's also an opportunity, not only a disaster completely.
Absolutely. Absolutely an opportunity, and agree with that. And I also wanted to go back and underscore something that you said early on in a previous response, which is that this is the fruit of so much Palestinian organizing, storytelling, media work, that has been going on for decades, that has produced the conditions also for this kind of shift. And I mean, I credit that with my own, change in views over the years. Not that I was never like, but I didn't know that much about it when I was younger, and I didn't like, I fell into the kind of classical framing of, old conflict, and it goes back thousands of years and it's complicated, that sort of framing when I was much younger. And it was really through reading, following, listening, watching Palestinians, that it became much clearer to me what was actually, going on. And like you said, the Zionist argument is a losing argument. So if you listen to these things, if you actually research it and study it, um and that's always been funnily, that's one of the things that Zionists would often say is, you don't know what you're talking about, you should go study it. And of course, when you actually encourage people to study the colonization and oppression of Palestinians, I think it becomes much clearer to them. But of course, also that's the fruit of books written by Palestinians, and as well as some of the new Israeli historians and folks that have kind of counteracted the history that had been, kind of, because again, in the West, like, we have a lot of books that people don't have access to often, and a lot of information that they don't have access to. So, um, all right, let's see. So next, there's a couple things I do want to touch on. Um, let's go though to the West Bank a bit, because obviously, I think there's been, I know, an uptick in settler violence. There's also been, it seems like, an uptick in Israeli state kind of military violence in the West Bank. There's also been enduring resistance. There was, I think it was the same night as the Iranian retaliatory response, that there was like an image that went around of some Palestinians knocking down a wall in the West Bank. Um, and I don't know how significant that was, like, materially speaking, but on a symbolic level, I think it resonated with a lot of people. Um, and you also wanted to talk, and I think we should, a little bit about the settlement movement in the West Bank and its relationship to the Zionist project more broadly. Um, so yeah, feel free to take it where you want within the West Bank. Obviously, there's been a lot of significant developments there, I think, since the last time we talked.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of developments, but they can be framed within the same kind of like war of points that we've been talking about earlier in our conversations, which is, the West Bank, first of all, is like around 5,000 kilometers squared. It has about 3 million people, different geographies within the West Bank, and Israel, when it occupied the West Bank, it dissected it materially. It built all these walls and checkpoints that could easily, for example, isolate certain areas from others, create more distance between, for example, Ramallah and Bethlehem, that used to take half an hour, ride, and now takes around 2 hours. So you can, because you have to go around Jerusalem and not through Jerusalem. So in many instances, the West Bank is a place where the frontiers of settler colonialism is also the frontiers of Israel's and Zionist settler colonialism exist. It's the place where a lot of the ideological settler groups, specifically the religious Zionist, they come from different ideological orientations, but are the ones willing to take the mantle of expanding in space, implanting new settlements, annexing land, and constructing new communities on top of Palestinian communities, and in the hope of one day being able to, of course, annihilate the Palestinian presence in the West Bank. And this is not something that I'm claiming or accusing them of. This is something that they, themselves profess of. Like, this is not an analysis. This is quite open speech, whether in the plans of Smotrich for the Palestinians, which is either ethnic cleansing or accepting to be some sort of slaves within, an Israeli religious state, people who will work for their masters, in this case, Israeli Jewish masters, or they would be killed. I mean, according to Smotrich, these are the three options that we, as Palestinians, for instance, have. And there's a long history for, the constructing of this religious version of Zionism, because remember, most of the Zionist ideologies were actually labor progressive in some parts, or I don't know in what world it could be considered progressive, but it was progressive, creating the kibbutzim, form of communal solidarity, building of life together, working in the land. That was part of the the construction of the initial mythology around the pioneer Zionist who goes into this very undeveloped land and develops it and makes the desert bloom. And now we have these religious Zionists who also come from, the Zionist movement's co-optation of some of the rabbis in Europe, in the 19th century, who were willing to go along in this whole Zionist project, but wanted to dress it up with, religious foundations around, the return to Judea and Samaria, for instance, the creation of a Jewish state that actually applies Jewish law. And it relates, of course, to like Talmudic teachings, or some version of Talmudic teachings, because there's a wide era of different interpretation around whether, Jews should have a state and whether it should be a Jewish state in terms of its law, and or they should wait for the Messiah, for instance, and different versions. I'm not an expert on that, but these religious Zionists have complete foreclosure when it comes to their claim about Palestine. They see it through the gaze of God, and it's the fact that God gave us this land and therefore it's ours. And it's unlike the atheist secular Zionist Jews that don't believe in God but still believe that God gave them this land. They actually believe that God provided them this land, and within their phantasmic construction, they've also devised various ways and means of what it means to hold power over the non-Jew. And in this sense, you have a very racialized division, very professed, that Jewish life is more important than Palestinian life. But not only that there's deep desire of, for instance, burning Palestinian villages. Actually, in the recent attacks of settlers, there's even what seems to be, the settler movement and the hilltop movement's own weapon construction. They've constructed fire bombs that are used to attack villages and burn houses, homes of people, and cars, and orchards, and olive trees. In fact, for the past 2 decades, they've been have systematically, for instance, uprooting olive trees and burning them. They have been systematically also attacking Palestinian homes and infrastructure, and we're talking about tens of thousands of attacks across the West Bank coming from some of the militias that these groups have been. And one of the facets of their power is that they're demographically expanding in terms of numbers, because they have families that actually have large number of kids, unlike, for instance, secular families. It's also changing the dynamics within Israeli society itself. That's why Israeli society is becoming more religious, becoming more also less secular, more fundamentalist. That's why we're seeing, for example, moves to turn the legal order within the Israeli state itself and reformulate it across right-wing religious ideologies. It has to do with demography. It has to do with increasing religiosity, and of course, increasing turn towards ideological foreclosures that revolve around religious doctrine. So we have these groups like the Hilltop Youth Movement, which establishes settlements, attacks Palestinians, and in many ways, in a funny way, ironically, emulate Palestinians in terms of, for instance, relationship to becoming a shepherd on the land. For instance, they act as if they are Palestinians. They see our own behavior, they copy it, and then they try to nativize themselves through these forms of emulation and mimicry on some level as well. But the deep desire to annihilate the Palestinians manifests within a broader context of a tit for tat that they see that they need to establish with Palestinian villages. This is not to rationalize it, because, again, Palestinian villages and the Palestinian rural areas specifically are always under attacks, various forms of attacks, mostly attacking material infrastructure and trees. I don't know what's their problem with olive trees, but they link it with us. They see the olive tree as a extension and embodiment of the Palestinian presence on this land. And for some reason, by burning it, they're burning our relationship to the land. That's how they see it. Although other strategies in the Zionist arsenal is also uprooting the trees and putting them on like big roundabouts in the roads within Israel itself. So in one way, they appropriate the symbol sometimes, and at the same time they burn it, and it creates a very confusing and sometimes schizophrenic for me. Why would you burn something then appropriate it in the same way, inhalate it, and then at the same time place it front of center? But it tells you something about also the Zionist settler that copies the native, but at the same time wants the native to be killed, appropriates his food, and at the same time wants the native to be gone or disappear. And the past 6 months, we can say that the extent of backing that the settlers received by their sheer presence within the government, and by the handing of wide weapons, by the creation again of organized militia, that on some level could at some point be capable of doing the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank without the need of the actual state. Now remember, like these settler militias are also part of the army and intelligence and security apparatus of the state itself. In many ways, they mimic the state. I mean, if you go to Gaza and see the massacres that are happening and the mass graves that were uncovered today only and yesterday, people are talking about heads being removed from the body, about skin not existing on people's bodies. I can't really factually completely, tell you if that's the case 100%, but that's what people have been.
There's also been discussions of organs being taken and things like this. Absolutely,
yeah. So I mean, it's not to try to attempt to differentiate too much between as if the problem is with these settlers, because these settlers operate alongside the state with coordination with the state. They are an extension and a spearhead of the settling movement that the state is actually vested in creating and entrenching in the West Bank, and eventually perhaps drive the Palestinians of the West Bank outside and rendering them refugees. But in essence, they also play a role of always ensuring that conflict inhalation remains a specter within the Palestinian rural areas, and also in some of the cities across the West Bank overall. So they're part of the dynamic of different actors, where you can see the Israeli state and the settlement as completing each other in many ways. They're kind of the horizontal actors that operate, in not in a vertical hierarchical order of the army. They do what is necessary without being confined to army regulation and state regulation, which is something actually, it harkens back to the Nakba, for instance, where the whole plan to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians was placed, but there was not always direct orders that are very, this is the plan, we're going to ethnically cleanse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It was just understood by the commanders of the Haganah at that time, which became the Israeli army, what they have to do, And there are a lot of these stories where, a soldier would come, what should we do with these Arabs? And, the commanders would look, that stupid, soldier asking the question, he should know what, he should do. I mean, the settlers are acting in a very similar way. They're doing things that the state itself cannot do still or until now in the West Bank, but it's actually doing in the Gaza more professedly. Actually, a lot of the settler militias are the ones combating in Gaza as well. And if we look at their numbers and the numbers of those killed in Gaza among the soldiers, we find an overrepresentation of the settler militias within the combat units specifically. Of course, like the more liberal, secular, or progressive hippies of the Zionist movement, they only throw the bombs from air, which actually kill most of the people. But they're the pilots and the elite brass of the Israeli army itself. I mean, not to make these distinctions, when it comes to us Palestinians, these distinctions in Israeli society matter very little, to be honest, specifically within the current debate in Israeli society between those who just want to end the war to return the Israelis imprisoned in Gaza and those who just want to expand it and kill without any form of any place where they would stop or any point that they would stop. So that's part of the picture. And in the past couple of weeks in the West Bank, there was a settler who was killed by, I don't know who by, but apparently perhaps by a Palestinian, and he's a shepherd settler, and he was found killed. And the settlers also, even before knowing what the story is completely about, already engaged in mass attacks on Palestinian villages in the Ramallah Nablus axis, or what we call here Road 60, which has a lot of the villages that crisscross Nablus and Ramallah or connect them together. And they burned a lot of homes. They killed around 6 Palestinians as well. So that's been part of that picture of the settler movement also using its power, using its own manufacturing of weapons, and it's also its state support to launch these form of attacks that are not done by the state itself or the army itself, and creating the conditions for massacres and loss of homes and material infrastructure within this thinking that this way the Arabs will understand their place, the Arabs will remain quiet, the Arabs will remain deterred. That's their way of thinking. And at the same time, there's the pleasure of asserting Zionist dominance and power that is being kind of decentralized and placed within each individual settler as someone who can dominate somebody else, as somebody who can assert his power and control over somebody else. And that's been part of the picture in the past couple of weeks in the West Bank, these forms of attacks that have been increasing. But at the same time, the other running thread in the north of the West Bank has been the ability of a very early nascent movement of resistance, armed, to withstand the 6 months intensive assault by the Israeli army, its intelligence and security apparatus, and even including the use of air power repeatedly in the north of the West Bank. And I think not only being able to withstand the assault, but also expanding in terms of numbers, recruits, and capacities in terms of their own also IED development, IED innovation, roadside bombs, and things like that. And to be honest, I didn't think that after October 7th, when the gloves were off, that that the resistance will be able to withstand. But it only goes to show, first of all, that I was wrong. But but the second thing, which is the deep thread that binds the Palestinian resistance to its own social environment, and the ability to recruit even more from the younger generation. And at the same time that there's a significant transfer of know-how coming from outside of Palestine for these groups, but also they're developing their own know-how as they engage in this duel with the Israeli military and intelligence services and security apparatus. And this kind of dialectic of confrontation is emerging. And in many in many ways, the capacity to resist is there. It hasn't been able as of yet to still create very concrete equations with the Israeli military on what they can do and can't do. But what we can see is that Israel, using this moment of October 7th, has tried to end the presence of the armed groups, but has failed. It has succeeded somewhat in containing them within a specific geography, but it hasn't been able to end this phenomena or to completely roll it back. And again, more developments in terms of equipment, tools, innovations that the resistance has been able to conjure up and create. So it's actually mounting to be a difficult, struggle for the Israelis. I mean, they can't even win in the West Bank. I mean, and they think they can win in Gaza and with Iran and with South Lebanon and Lebanon more broadly, and other areas. Very limited confined movement that has been going since October 7th. That's part of the development. And we saw one of the innovative practices of entrapping a settler with a flag only today, which again tells you about this dynamic, that the settler desire to annihilate even the symbolic presence of Palestinians, being completely riled up by the presence of one single flag as he was driving his car, stopping his car to go and take that flag out and destroy it. And then the flag blew up in his face, and this wasn't used for the first time, but it tells you about this kind of this lack within one of the things about Israel, if you go visit, is that it's one of the countries that has a lot of flags everywhere, and it plants flags everywhere, even in cities and old settlements like Tel Aviv, that you would think that Israelis are comfortable in saying that oh, this is ours, it's not gonna be taken away from us anymore. And we don't need to like place a flag. And I don't think it tells you something about how strong Israelis feels toward Israel as a form of national identification, and that's why they place flags everywhere. I think in many ways it hides this kind of level of deep insecurity when it comes to their own relationship to the land and the rightfulness of it, but also to their the feeling of existential anxiety that is foreclosed by this, visual appearance of the flag everywhere. It is as if each flag tells every Zionist that this land is yours, this land is yours. It has to repeat that, from the outside inside, as a form as a form of affirmation of that this is Israel, that you're not in the wrong place, that this is your rightful place. But again, it hides a deep insecurity, and at the same time, when the Palestinian flag appears, it's as if like something in the symbolic order has been ruptured for these Zionists. And we've historically had a lot of stories around the Palestinian flag, whether it's people raising the flag in the first Intifada or before the first Intifada on churches and mosques and universities, and the Israelis will go for a lot of effort to just take this piece of cloth down, because for them it was a complete disruption. It's something that riled them up, and they need to efface the flag and efface what it represents, of course, and that's why they take raising the Palestinian flag still very seriously, in, for instance, in Jerusalem, or once it done in 1948 lands, or in any place where the Palestinian flag appears and disrupts this moment of I don't know, this moment or this obsessive thinking and rethinking that you need to have to affirm your land. It's like I would describe it as a middle finger. I think we Palestinians appear as middle fingers to the Israelis, but the flag also appears like a middle finger, and on some level it catches their eye, and there's an insistence almost immediately to take it down. I mean, and Palestinians laugh about this because it tells us a lot about their insecurity. It's like, oh, a flag is making them that riled up, that angry. It's like, what is it in them psychologically that makes them judder or like be afraid or be completely tense when they see a flag, a Palestinian flag, and the settler stops his car, and it was his fate, a mistake. I mean, it was trapped, and I think this just speaks to the ingenuity and the creative agency, of course, of Palestinians, of using their own flag as a trap, as something that will for sure get an Israeli Zionist to come and take it down. And I think in this case, I mean, it wasn't mistaken. I mean, we saw that unfold in front of us. So again, I mean, the tensions have been in many ways rising. There's much more to the armed resistance in the north of the West Bank than perhaps I earlier thought. And at the same time, the settler movement is attempting as much as possible to also use the October 7th to increase its settlement presence, create new outposts and settlements, and enforce a new logic of violence in the occupied territories, specifically in the West Bank, but through its repeated attacks on people. That's how I would summarize at least what I've been saying.
Appreciate that. There's a couple of things, and you may have touched on them, but I wanted to kind of dig into them a little bit more. So obviously, there's also been this the big attack on Tulkarm. If I mispronounced that, apologies. But with that one, there's been folks online who have kind of shown like this isn't Gaza, but it looks like it in terms of the level of destruction of the buildings and things like that there and infrastructure. And in addition to that, like there's kind of two things that I wanted to mention. One was I think his name is Abu Shuja. You can correct me on these when you respond, but it was
Obviously,
a yeah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader who was believed to be martyred, right? And shows up at this funeral for the martyrs of this attack. And so this is kind of it seemed like a big moment, just at least among the folks that were there, but also I think just nationally, internationally, in terms of people who are following the resistance and things like that. But alongside that, there's also this statement that Feta puts out, I guess yesterday, that they're calling for a general strike, and they're certainly objecting to the destruction of the infrastructure in the West Bank and things like this. And it was an interesting development on some level. I know we've talked plenty about kind of we've talked about Fatah, we talked about the Palestinian Authority and kind of this history in the West Bank. And, so folks can go back and look at that episode, particularly the one we did on kind of counterinsurgency in the West Bank and so on, to get more of that history. But I'm interested also, being there, what you kind of think of those developments in the West Bank. I guess the two, the attack, the survival of this martyr, but also the statement by Feta and like what that dynamic looks like or means on the ground.
I mean, look, I think again, I mean, the give and take between a very highly sophisticated Israeli establishment and security system and intelligence with the most advanced surveillance software and infrastructure in the globe. What the West Bank is a lab for other surveillance modalities across the world. And then you have, again, Tulkarem is a small town. It's adjacent to what is called the Green Line, which is the 1967 borders. It's significant because near Tulkarem, there's also a large infrastructure of settlements and illegal presence by the Israelis. And you have Nur al-Shams camp, a very small area. And at the same time, you have the development of a resistance movement in this area. Again, capable of withstanding a lot of the assault. Part of the places where the earlier attempts in Jenin and Nablus expanded to across other cities as well and towns in the north of the West Bank, like Tubas, Qalqilia, Tulkarem, etc. And where this network of fighters have risen. And sometimes when you have any network, there are people that tend to stand out in terms of their charisma, personal presence, or sometimes by what their enemies say about them. Like one of the issues with the issue of Abu Shuja as a figure, I mean, is that the PA tried to arrest him and the PA tried to spread rumors around him, but he was for sure one of the people that had a highly significant social base of people who love or adore him within his own local community and local society. And why I'm trying to say this is that one of the arsenals in the counterinsurgency in the West Bank is the way the PA plays a role to attempt, through its informant networks and through its presence socially, to create and assassinate people on a social symbolic level before they're actually assassinated materially. And in this case, this just simply didn't work out. Not only did it work out, even the story of his death that turned out to be wrong and his presence in the funeral also created, this moment of despair around his death, and then, that hope of, being generated. After all, Palestine is the land of resurrection, no? And, in many ways, resurrection, here interplayed, of course, on some level, and for a lot of people that they saw in, that, story, a lot of hope and symbolism around it. So I mean that's when it comes to Abu Shaja and his presence. I mean, the Israelis are saying that he's significant because he's a leader and he's blah blah blah. And look, I don't know. I mean, there's one thing that I've known since I've studied and lived here, is that in many instances, Israeli security usually exaggerates the importance of any individual when they assassinate him. And this is not to mean that they're not important. It's just that they try as if they want to create this, this story and narrative to their own society, but perhaps to their own selves, that when they do something or act something out, that they're doing something very difficult and very tough and very important. And for each tactical success, sometimes the Israelis over exaggerate, the nature and significance of a lot of different people, and or maybe they downplay and they're more significant than what the Israelis are saying. But what I'm trying to say is that why I'm saying that, because the resistance here does not necessarily rely on the existence of one person. There is a moment that resistance networks become more reliant on an environment and the ability to generate recruits and the ability to expand horizontally, and the material environment that enables, first of all, the transfer of know-how and weapons, enables the expansion of tactics and tools and arsenal. And I think at this current moment in the West Bank, and especially in the north, whether Tulkarem, Jenin, or other areas, it is, the resistance have been under this severe attack and rollback attempt against their presence and their expansion, but it has not necessarily worked in a way that you could point to significantly. Again, I think that in many ways there is an Israeli relative failure here. And they haven't been talking much about it, but what we're seeing signs of is increasing sophistication of Palestinian attacks in the West Bank, increasing use of different material in these attacks. They're being filmed, they're being produced as well. The resistance can withstand assault through, hide, and seek forms, but also engage the Israeli military. In the Jenin, in the Tulkarem operation, I think 8 soldiers were injured, something like that. So the Israelis are also coming in with cost to their own personnel, to their own vehicles. It's not like an uncostly, easy entering into the camp and leaving the camp. But they have been using the same tactics that they have used since the Second Intifada, which is the Israelis identify the society itself as the enemy. And once they identify the society itself as the enemy, what they try to do, as for instance, Walid Daqqa tells us, is sear the consciousness of Palestinians that, any resistance means total destruction materially of your well-being, your infrastructure. We're going to destroy your homes. We're going to destroy the water network. We're going to destroy the electricity network. We're going to make the camp uninhabitable. We're going to push you outside of the camp. We're going to destroy the presence of the camps. Many people now are warning that, there's a wide assault on the Palestinian camps also within the West Bank, and that there's some sort of policy within Israel to actually refigure and rechange the very material fabric and architecture of these camps by assaulting their infrastructure and redrawing them like they've been doing in the Gaza Strip in many ways. And there's a lot of these comparisons being made with the Jenin refugee camp and the Nur Shams and other places, whereby Israel is trying to disfigure this urban dense place and reformulate it in a way that in the future will not prove to be difficult to infiltrate, or will end this condition, this more existential, political, symbolic condition of Palestinian refugees remaining in camps. At least that's the hope. That's the assault on UNRWA. That's also the assault on the material infrastructure of the camps themselves on some level. Some Palestinians are warning of that. I'm not saying that I totally agree or disagree. I'm just saying that, in many ways, this is still a war of wills happening between, whether it's in Gaza. We saw, for instance, a week ago how people in Gaza, once they just got a sense that they could go make it back to the north of the West Bank, we saw them vote with their feet in terms of returning to the north of the West Bank. Tens of thousands were trying to make it, and some actually made it. So what I'm saying is that it's a war of wills, not only with the resistance, but with the people as well. No, but the Israelis identify Palestinian society itself as the enemy, and that therefore, whenever there's resistance, or even when there's no resistance, there's always an attack on Palestinian society. And in this case, they only use resistance as an opportunity to reaffirm the extent of power that they can exercise in specific areas or in specific conditions. So that's part of at least the picture when it comes to like the destructions that have been happening also in Jenin refugee camp and Nur Shams camp. They have been, a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed, if not most of it. And a lot of the homes have also been damaged by the Israeli bulldozers that made it into the camps, and the gunfights, etc. But again, I mean, there's still it's a war of wills, and I think Palestinians, if there's a resistance that is organized, effective, capable of withstanding Israeli assault, willing to sacrifice itself, authentic, can speak a voice, they're also willing to give it a lot in terms of their own lives and material well-being, and their own, because they see in the resistance a hope, and that is also, being being written in Tul Karim and in the story of Abu Shaja himself, as the ability to evade death or belie death and come back alive, although he was already alive, but at least on that symbolic level. Now the second thing, Jared, I mean, look, the thing about Fatah is that Fatah is not one thing necessarily, or one group. There is the central committee of Fatah. It has leaders, and they sit and meet. But Fatah in different localities has different associations and leaders, and some are more nationalist perhaps, or would back resistance. Others wouldn't, but stand with the PA and its policy of attacking resistance and its symbolic and material foundations if possible. So there's no one single Fatah that we can speak about in a very concise sense. That's one element. The second element is that despite the importance of general strikes on a symbolic level, strikes historically in Palestine were used to defy the military authorities' hold on the public space within Palestinian towns. So in 1936, or that was against the British, one of the longest strikes for 6 months occurred. In the first Intifada, for instance, the strikes were meant to indicate a signal and send a symbolic message that the ones who rule and have authority over Ramallah or Hebron or Nablus are the groups of Palestinians, or the united leadership at that time, which represented the will of the resistance group, that they were capable of leading people to work, or not leading people to work, but mobilizing them on the streets. So generally strikes or general strikes had two components. There's no working day, but now we're not going to sit idle. We're going to mobilize for direct action and demonstrations and clashes. Now, after Oslo, first of all, it just doesn't make sense anymore to do a strike against Israel when the PA is the one that has civil and security control to some degree of a place like Ramallah. It just it doesn't have the same effect of defying the military authority, and so these non-cooperation tactics don't work. The second element of it is that the strikes now lack any form of mobilization on a mass level. So people basically get a day off from work, and they spend it at home. It has some symbolic, perhaps emotional, issue, but I'm kind of cynical towards it because I don't see it as a highly important arsenal or tactic at this moment in our struggle. I see it has a symbolic importance when it comes to you've lost some people, you have to respect their loss on some level. But in Palestine, loss is a daily fact, and that kind of management of daily loss, daily martyrs, daily prisoners, and the continuation of like the rhythm of life, has different implications when you stop the workday. Don't get me wrong, I'm not for working days, but what I'm trying to say is that in many ways it's used on some level as a counter-insurgent tactic, not as an insurgent tactic. Like, strikes could be seen as well as demobilization strategies, attempt to like figure something symbolically, but at the same time it's intended to demobilize people, separate them from the public space, place them at homes, and it's not, and this is where the absence of a larger social movement, it's not meant to mobilize people. For those in the PA system, a strike is something they can say, oh, hey, we did something, we did like a strike and we stopped the day, and we're still nationalists, without actually risking anything, without actually mobilizing for anything. And you know I'm not trying to say that I'm against strikes, but I'm just saying that in it's a much more complicated, tense relationship of how a strike or a general strike can have an important psychological and symbolic importance, specifically when you have around 19 people killed in Tulkarem, and at the same time, this feeling that binds us all, that this is a loss, that we should all, you know we should make the world stop for a moment, and and have a conal refuge, and but again, the demobilization aspect of it and the repeated calls that comes and emanate sometimes from within the counterinsurgent force itself, because they're the ones that are capable to close the entire West Bank. They're the ones that have that power. Um, Indicates a level of its use for a demobilization, rather mobilization, as a counterinsurgency tactic to me. And we should just be aware of that. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think it's probably worth saying something quickly, because like a lot of folks would make an argument in other situations, right? That strike is not really symbolic or psychological as much as it is material, right? Like you're trying to stop the flow of capital and the means of production, strike at that point. But I imagine as economic society and whatnot exists within the West Bank, that there's problems with it viewing it in that way. Um, Thoughts on that?
I mean, look, I think this is where like place makes a difference. No, I mean, I'm not trying to say that it doesn't stop economic flows. It does. But remember, it also hurts a lot of like workers that work on a daily basis, not ones paid monthly. It has implications, like there's always a discourse surrounding some of these general strikes, especially when they're done by the PA, where people are getting a day off, but day off from bullshit jobs, mostly. Like most of the places that really closed were like the ministries and the public, administrative apparatus that, they actually don't work. There was a study by, I forgot again, the study that, produced by some Arab research center, and I forgot the name, and it tried to assess the productivity of the average Palestinian Authority employee. And it said within a working day, he actually works only 20 minutes throughout the whole working day. So there's this kind of, there is in many ways a strike on a level that not necessarily really hurts economic flows necessarily in a way, and they're not done because they're anti-capitalist stances or anti-economic flow stances or for worker rights or anything like that. They're done in terms of in the context of loss or in the context of defying the military authority in the past. But there were always implications in terms of also resistance groups. For instance, the first Intifada, if you overextended your strikes, you're hurting, for instance, a lot of the merchants, no? And if you're hurting a lot of the merchants, you're losing them as a strata that will stop supporting you at some point if you, use the strike or overuse the strike in ways that could harm. So it was important, for example, the resistance in the first Intifada, to the extent possible, to make sure that it doesn't lose that strata completely, that it's still a significant strata within your society will not become antagonistic to you and see you as not taking their interest in consideration and things like that. So it moves from these kind of like tactical considerations that you have to take, the extent you want to, like, in a national liberation struggle, what is a primary contradiction that you want to place front and center? What is a secondary contradiction that you want to place front and center? But again, what you're speaking to is of course, I mean, there are strikes that have, disrupt material and economic flows and create a lot of problems. And then, you can get compromises from whoever is in power. But remember, in this context, it's not in that sense. It's done mostly on a, everybody's closed down, the public, the stores, the merchants, everybody. It's a more of a symbolic. Israel is not going to come negotiate with you. Oh, you're harming your own economy. I mean, they don't care because it's not their own power. And the PA or its representative or its extension within society is the one that place this strike front and center. Again, I'm not saying I'm against these strikes. I mean, I do think that, I just think that in a way, we can also read them in a dual way. In a sense, they are important symbolic gestures and emotionally central, but they're also, in many ways, when they're not as they were in our tradition, accompanied by mass mobilization of people for demonstrations, for direct action, for whatever it is possible to mobilize for funerals, etc. They become a day off from work, and at the same time they become a means through which the Palestinian Authority itself can claim, on the one hand, to still have some national credential by, like, we're in pain, but we're together in pain. Although they're the ones that were launching the rumors against somebody like Abu Shuja, his comrades in arms. Some of them were killed in the Israeli raid into Tulkarem. So it plays this dual role, and in Palestinian politics, you could be easily deceived by appearances. Let's put it that way. I mean, there's a rich secret, if you want, life, and there's a rich way of how a system that holds the Palestinian flag, the flag that we talked about, in front of it, all of its ministries and offices, and in terms of its own self-representation across the globe as well. The Palestinian Authority still has Palestine in it, but at the same time, in many ways, being an institution devoted to counterinsurgency, devoted to betraying the possibility of Palestine and to killing the capacity of the Palestinians to resist, based on their interest and based on a philosophy of defeat and eternalization of this defeat, making it eternal. So in many ways, that is a very pragmatic, counterinsurgent force where you can initiate a strike not because you want people to mobilize, because you want to do something symbolic at the level of the minimum, but at the same time actually make it a moment where people are demobilized and make it a moment where people are at their home, confined to their own narrow, intimate space, and not meeting face to face together in the public space or anything like that. It's a tough conversation to have because I had this conversation also with my colleagues in Bezet in the beginning of the war on Gaza because the university was closed, the roads were difficult in the beginning, and people were afraid of the settler lash, and we were scared that our students will be on the roads, and things could we wanted to protect the students at the same time, not end the academic calendar. And there was a discussion about whether as this war unfolded and this genocide became clear in its brutality, whether anything should be open or everything should be closed. And I always fell in this conversation on in the absence of a social organized movement and with the existence of this Trojan horse in our midst. I always fell in this conversation more on we need people to meet each other face to face, and we need people to come to the university because within the university they're at least exchanging thoughts, ideas, emotions, whatever it is that they're exchanging. That form of exchange is itself important and central. And then if everybody's simply at his home, you're just creating more atomized, lonely selves rather than maybe within the confines of their homes with their families they're not. But families are traditionally not revolutionary actors. Like families are scared for their children, and families tend to prevent their children from engaging in revolutionary action or political action. It's only horizontal relationship like friendship and other forms of association that sometimes build the bedrock of let's go out there and change the world together. And in many ways, yeah, I mean, I fell more on that side. But i do I do think that in many instances now in Palestinian current moment, strikes are used as a counterinsurgent tactic, not as an insurgent tactic.
It's very interesting, and I mean, it makes some sense, and also, I mean, I think it's like, as you're describing it, I'm thinking a little bit about, it actually reminds me a little bit of when, Juneteenth became a national holiday in the United States, right? And so this was, like, done, right, amid, George Floyd rebellion and mass protests, right? And so it's this very, like, oh, we'll give everybody the day off and we'll recognize this history of, the end of slavery. Juneteenth is a problematic, day in itself because the idea behind it is that, um, really what it was about was that slavery didn't actually end until the army came to liberate the enslaved people in certain areas. It's not that they didn't know that, the union had won or whatever, but it was actually that, like, it requires the force of arms to actually ensure that people aren't, enslaved and so on. And or I mean, people ran away in mass too, which was the general strike that, as Du Bois called it. But the point I'm making is that there were reactions I remember as it was going on among people I was working with, of one, like, "Why do you white people get today off too?" Which was a very valid reaction. But also, like, that, what do these state imposed or, even employer imposed, is it really a strike, right? If your employer says it's a strike, or if the kind of political authority that dictates, the calendar of your work month or whatever says you don't have to go to work. The answer is no. It's not, because they're making that decision, and they've already figured out the plan and the rationale, et cetera, around it. So yeah, anyway, that's an interesting discussion. Um, we've been talking for a while, but I want to at least spend a little bit of time here before we wrap up. You mentioned Walid Daqqa, and I know that there's a longer conversation which people should check out on the East is a podcast, that you and Rana Barakat, again, please correct my pronunciation, but um, had, which, anyways, people should definitely go listen to it, because you both offer a lot of thoughts there, that obviously we won't have the time to fully replicate. Um, but you mentioned searing consciousness, and obviously we wanted to take time to honor and mark his passing here. Obviously, he dies as a result of political imprisonment, and is martyred by the failure to provide him with proper medical care and all of these things, as well as release him at times when he could have been released many times. Um, but obviously, he's significant not just because of that, but also because of who he was. Things that he wrote, actions he took, theories he put forward. So, yeah, I'd say what you would like to say, regarding that.
Thanks, Jared. And your pronunciation of Rana's name is okay. Don't worry. When it comes to Walid, Walid is important because, of course, in many ways, he embodied throughout his life various, various identities, being a Palestinian from 48, on some level, being also a citizen of the state of Israel, at the same time engaging in resistance at his young age, coming from the Triangle area, which is adjacent to places like Tulkarem, but within the other side of the Green Line. And, being imprisoned for about 40 years, less, I think, than that. And, in the Palestinian contemporary and, historical experiences, the British came, the prison as a place where, as we say, the best of us go, has been part and parcel of our, national consciousness, tragic stories. It's a site where Walid described best by saying that the prison is a parallel time, because it's outside of the social time. And Walid compared between, the prison as a static place and also static time, because the units of time within the prison are marked differently than outside of prison. But he still made sure throughout his writings to make and distill that despite him being in this static parallel time and parallel place, that, the prison is a microcosm of a bigger prison outside, specifically in the Palestinian condition. And through his reading of the materiality, the psychological and affective reaction to imprisonment, the relationship with prisoners, the interests, the material interests in the forms of organizations that change through time in imprisonment, he was able of also theorizing the various forms and modes of torture that the Israeli state were using in these prisons. Very articulate, very profound, and also in many ways was very suited to understanding the Palestinian contemporary conditions. And that's why I think for a lot of my generation and the younger generation of intellectuals and writers and readers. I mean, Walid played an important role in also introducing us to new modes of articulation and understanding of our contemporary condition that didn't necessarily come from somebody like me, like a spectator or something like that, but somebody who embodied the very struggle himself, the nexus of being what Basil Araj would call an engaged intellectual, somebody who's using his intellectual capacities and his literary product in a way that is not completely dissociated from his own praxis and practice. And in this case, attempting to define, the condition of the Palestinians in the past 2 decades or so. And I think his writings grew in maturity and in impact, from the Second Intifada onwards. And there's a couple of gems in his writing, including like short novels actually intended for a young age, for people for children and young people more broadly, but they can actually speak to anybody as well. And that's one of the the geniuses of these literary takes, is that despite them being in very simple language and constructed for people who are 10, 11, 12, 13 to read, they're also could be read by somebody who's very old or has a lot of I don't know, knowledge and intellectual capacities, but at the same time completely enjoy these stories. So Walid combined what he called his way of escaping the prison through his imagination and writing, and through this articulation of resistance to prison by his practice of intellectual engagement with the outside world that he called a mirror, through which he asserts and affirms his own life and self. So that's part of it. Walid is not the only person that writes in prison. There are many, people who write in prison. There's many literary figures in prison. There's many people who've articulated a lot of different things. But for sure, Walid was one of the people that stood out. There's many leaders in prison, political leaders. There's many, the Palestinian experience with prison has imprisoned. Israel has imprisoned about 1 million Palestinians since 1967. So we're talking about a third of the population and a third of all men, in Palestine. So, it's a form of mass confinement. People go in and come out. But Walid was one of the people that had a long-term prison sentence and spoke through his experience of prison to a larger, more universal implication of what imprisonment mean and what remaining steadfast and practicing forms of escape from prison, because that's a question that every prisoner asks, when he goes to prison: how can I escape? And that's the dialectic between the prisoner and the prison as an architecture and as a material place that confines you. And Walid escaped through his writing and through his imagination and through his relationship and language that he constructed around the Palestinian struggle. And to that, we owe him a lot. Unfortunately, he wasn't able, and of course he escaped in a different way, which is by smuggling his sperms outside of prison and with his wife Sanaa, making a beautiful little girl called Milad. And Milad means birth. That's also part of his story. Also, getting married while he was in prison is part of his story. Campaigning for his own release and launching a legal campaign was part of his own story. Writing a theater, and for that theater to be produced and shown in Haifa as part of his story, and a lot of different other parts of his life that are important. And we were talking about Walid and his death through medical negligence, his killing through medical negligence, and now the Israeli state still has decided to withhold his body from burial and to keep it imprisoned until he finishes his sentence. So his body will be imprisoned until his sentence is finished, which is in a year or so. And this form of post-mortem holding and withholding of the bodies that remains part and parcel of also how what it tells us about the Israeli state, that not only avenges you when you're alive, but also avenges your own body after death, withholding you from burial or keeping you away from or keeping your body so a funeral wouldn't happen and a social gathering would not happen and face-to-face encounters wouldn't happen and people raising the Palestinian flag would not happen. Again, it speaks to this whole insecure colonialist mindset that we've talked about earlier. Yeah.
Appreciate you laying all that out again, and I am always so like the withholding of the body thing is always it's like what a creepy thing to do, but I get also the as
Not
you're
only
talking
that, Joe,
about.
do you know what they do? They freeze the bodies in fridges. Some of them they bury in numbers cemeteries, so they don't have names, and they're buried in numbers, and each number is associated with a body. But a lot of these bodies are actually frozen in fridges, and they're placed in positions that they're not laid necessarily as in sleeping posture. Sometimes a body is just placed in a way that once you release them, the legs are up, or and we had in the past couple of years incidents where families would receive their loved ones, their legs above, they're not resting in a resting position, etc. And some of those parents, and you can't, because they're frozen, you can't really touch their bodies because you would actually break their body, in that state. And so that was part of like what we can call post-mortem torture, that is attempting to also imprint this kind of image after somebody's death in his loved ones' minds, in ways that are I don't know what to call it. I don't know how to construct language, but for me it's a form of, again, postmodern also forms of torture that the Israeli state has been practicing in many ways. Yeah.
Ugh, that is grim. I don't know if I want to leave on such a grim note. Um, let's see. What else could we what else did we not talk about that I could bring up? Um, I don't know, man. You have any thoughts on that? Any questions for me?
Yeah, I do. I mean, can I smoke?
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine.
Um, are you done with your questions, or?
I am done with my questions. Thank you, Laura Librarian, for the $10 contribution. Appreciate that. Also, my car broke down this weekend, folks. So if you want to sign up for Patreon right now, it's a good time. So let's see. Yeah, he does need to smoke now. All right, y'all. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up there, even though that is not the happiest note to close on. But I very much appreciate you, Aboud, as always, for these conversations. I know that we will be back, and on a more hopeful note, I do think you go back to the beginning of the analysis, kind of in the early conversations, and I do think that you know, Israel as an entity is continuing to be more and more isolated. I don't see a kind of way forward for them currently to achieve, victory and closure of this war. And doesn't mean, things can't change. It also means that, I mean, even the resistance factions recently said that they're kind of, this was a kind of interesting statement. I think Hamas put something out that, well, I'm not sure it came through them directly, but it was reported in like Al Mayadeen that, um, uh, that basically Israel has continued to not negotiate in good faith at all. And so, the Palestinian resistance factions are basically just, not to say that they're not open to negotiation or whatever, but they've kind of let go of some of the, there was a round of negotiations. There was, an offer given. It obviously wasn't significant, and they decided to push it off. They responded to it with new, you know, what they would be willing to accept, and of course that wasn't accepted. But there was an interesting comment in Al Mayadeen, was that now Hamas is considering alternative approaches, and obviously we can't speculate or know exactly what that means. Um, but I do think it sort of speaks to, in some ways, one, the failure of Israel to um, be able to achieve a sort of strategic victory, but also that there's still difficulty in, and maybe it's what you've said earlier on in some of our conversations, of that Israel would have to recognize a failure, and it's not ready to do that, and so it's not willing to accept certain conditions um, of closure, right? Um, And at the same time, of course, the Palestinian resistance obviously wouldn't be willing to agree to a deal that didn't meet, some basic standards that they've been holding to for quite some time. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interesting place, and I don't know how much more we have to say about that. But I do think in terms of, yeah. Anyway, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, look, I mean, it's not strange that, in the history of liberation movements, that you could have, what many in the military science realm would call a defeat on the part of these resistances, but then again, at the same time, in the same moment, simultaneously, a political defeat and a strategic defeat for the more, capable power in terms of its technology and mobilization of personnel, etc. And Israel is not immune to that. I mean, Israel has in Gaza been able to destroy Gaza. That has very different implications in the sense that now it can leverage the way Gaza is reconstructed, if it even wants to allow that reconstruction to unfold, and who does the reconstruction, and what political group or party will do this reconstruction. So since January, the Israeli tactic revolves around these small, entries to specific areas, then, leaving, like what happened in the Shifa hospital, about 3 weeks ago. These tactical brigade level, entry and leaving, but also targeting specifically people who are attempting to organize society and regenerate, some sort of like control, and like police personnel or people from within the social and ecosystem of the Gaza society. So in many ways, Israel wants to create this kind of perpetual form of ruins and destruction, but it's also underestimating Palestinian ability to cope, adapt, and create. It has always underestimated that, and it underestimates it now. And the second thing is that it's attempting to change, some of the material and demographic balance between North and South in the Gaza Strip, who can go and who can't go, creating this corridor in the middle of the Strip, sustaining perhaps a more perpetual form of military occupation later on. so it's creating these possibilities, but at the same time, it still has an active, wide, and organized resistance in the Gaza Strip, and still have not been able to pressure the people to get the resistance to surrender. So that give and take in the Gaza is, unfolding in a way that, the more of this will not actually create better conditions on the negotiating table. The other front is the ceasefire negotiations. And the ceasefire negotiations from a Palestinian perspective, at this moment, you've basically lost, the worst nightmare happened in terms of the destruction of infrastructure, at least materially. I mean, what remains is like protecting as much as possible the people that remain, alive and unharmed by the Israeli military machine directly. But in many ways, the infrastructure, the built areas have been also, in large part destroyed. There's very little incentive for the resistance to go into a ceasefire negotiation where they just sign off on the continuation of a war later on. So, I mean, the resistance has been very clear. It will only, do an exchange of prisoners if Israel declares the end of the war and withdraws from Gaza, and then you have a concrete plan for, reconstruction of the Gaza Strip and a reformulation of relations. And Israel could go down that route, but that means recognizing that the resistance in Gaza remains intact and remains the one in control, which means a defeat, in the eyes of its own population and the world, and it will end the careers of various politicians and generals and create a lot of reckoning within Israeli society. Despite the fact that probably the Gaza after that will have a long time, it will not be a threat, in any way, at least on a military level, to Israelis. Or the Israeli state, but on some level, that will be a tough thing for the Israelis to swallow. So they're continuing with this attempts at expansion, attempts at intensifying, and testing the extent to which Palestinians are willing to withstand or not withstand their assaults. And thus far it has failed and actually created a lot of diplomatic, public relations, whatever issues that now the Israeli state is facing because of its monstrosity and its use of unbridled and uncontained firepower. So whatever choices Israel has, it's all damaging, it's all problematic, and it's in this dilemma. And of course, I'm one of the people that, when I read Israeli society, I also don't underestimate its ability to generate, power, will, the ability to in moments of stress for that society to also, have, generative capacities. I mean, the Israelis historically have been very competent and capable in terms of military power, at least in their early days. They have, in specific moments, been the ones surprising and their enemies and adversaries, very competent in different areas when it comes to their own kind of rendition of historical narrative. And so I'm not the one that says that necessarily this is a moment where Israeli society and its establishment and military facing defeat cannot come up with some sort of generative capacities and solutions. But I do think that for a lot of other reasons that there's also signs of Israeli power being dwindled, being its deterrence being ruptured in very significant ways, its intercommunal relationship being severely stretched and in high tension, its demographic changes, its social changes, its ethnic and class relations is also significant in any reading of Israeli society. how it interacts, with its own military and how it views the world, the rise of its own like religious fascism that we talked about, that has become more prominent and dominant, that it's leading it to, many of the mistakes that we have seen it, conduct, and many of the self-inflicted harm that it has committed. Some of it calculated harm. They knew the cost and they did it anyways. Some of it is just mistakes, like October 7th unfolding itself. And in many ways, it's not the society that it used to be, But there are these two struggles within the society, or two ways of looking and trying to, assess where it is. We shouldn't completely underestimate, its generative capacities in our analysis. Nor should we place ourselves in a place where, like, oh, we're winning, and it's not like that. I mean, as as long as a battle is happening, a battle is a battle of wills. It's a battle of tactics and capacities. And if tomorrow, for instance, I don't know, Israel, reaches all the Israelis imprisoned in Gaza and kills all the leadership, then maybe we have a different, equation, and we're talking about a different thing. And that's why it's important, for everybody to understand that, and for the allies of Palestine, wherever they are, that it's a moment to write, mobilize, galvanize, to act, to find whatever ways possible, whatever means possible, to be a participant in this struggle. I would never underestimate the impact of any act, whatever it is. It's specifically that, who knows, sometimes, small acts, compile and accumulate into something important. And this is a moment that we should be, for sure engaged alongside the battle for Palestine.
Right on. Absolutely. That's a great place for us to end it. And so thank you for that. And again, folks, we'll be back. We have another show later today at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time with VJ Prashad. And tomorrow we have Kai Heron to talk about degrowth and eco-modernism. And on Thursday we have Two Black and Rasul Moat to talk about laundering black rage. So it's a bunch coming up, and actually, I think we'll be adding something on Wednesday to talk about, or Thursday night to talk about encampments as a strategic considerations around encampments as a political tactic. So, anyway, thanks again, Aboud. This has been a great conversation as always, and I look forward to our next one as well.
Thanks, Jared, for having me, and my love for everybody.
Yeah, me too.